Hello, everyone, and welcome to an encore video performance of the Violin Concerto No. 2 by Florence Price with Kahng as a soloist, broadcast originally in February of 2018. I'm joined by the distinguished concertmaster of the APO, professor of violin at the University of Arkansas, and national and internationally recognized soloist, Dr. Arend Kahng. Hello, Arend.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, Stephen.
We're delighted to have you here tonight, and hopefully our internet connections will support our conversation back and forth, me from the West Coast to Northwest Arkansas, and to all of you around the country and perhaps overseas as well. This is an exciting opportunity for us to revisit a dynamic discovery and addition to the 20th century violin concerto repertoire. I remember when Arend Kahng came to me and suggested a performance, a world premiere actually, of the Violin Concerto No. 2 of Florence Price. And at that time, I didn't know who Florence Price was, and Arend kindly gave me lots of information, and immediately after listening, I was so enthusiastic to do this concerto that we decided to program it and present the world premiere. And there's a lot of information about this work and the extraordinary circumstances in which it was found. Arend, when you first met this concerto, I think you had an immediate design to perform it. Is that right?
Yes, my first thought was, is there a recording of this? I would really love to hear it. Of course, looking at a score and imagining it is a very different experience than actually hearing somebody's rendition of the realization of it. And it was both shocking and also slightly exciting to realize that it hadn't been recorded.
And in fact, after some study, we learned that there was no performance of the work actually, and I'll tell you a little about that. But thank you, Arend. I'd like to give you a little biographical information about this piece and also Florence Price. Her name is becoming more and more known, especially within the last decade. And it's exciting to learn the extent of her compositions and her compositional career, and fascinating and even heartening to learn about the circumstances of the rediscovery of much of her music. It was almost like a reality TV show. In 2009, a couple of home renovators picked up a rundown, vandalized property in rural Illinois, about 70 miles south of Chicago. And although a tree branch had fallen through the roof of this house, these renovators found in the attic an undamaged, unassuming stack of old papers that had once belonged to a woman named Florence Price. Little did they know that among these papers were the long lost musical manuscripts by one of the United States' greatest 20th century composers, at that time virtually unknown. Florence Price was born in 1887 in Little Rock, Arkansas, not too far from where the Arkansas Philharmonic performs. And Florence Beatrice Price grew up in a middle-class African-American household at the end of the Reconstruction era. In 1903, she began study at the New England Conservatory, one of the era's few desegregated music schools at the time. She had an extraordinary talent, and she finished degrees in both organ performance and education in just 3 years, while also finding time to study composition with the conservatory's most prominent composer, George Whitefield Chadwick, who was certainly the most prominent American Impressionist composer, but also one of the most important American composers in early American classical music history. Price was the first Black woman to have her music performed by a major American orchestra when in 1933, the Chicago Symphony performed her symphony in E minor. The symphony was very well received, and this was her first major orchestral success. And in 1943, in November of that year, Price wrote to Serge Koussevitzky, the music director of the Boston Symphony, who had a great reputation and record of programming works by new composers. And Price asked him to consider performing some of her scores. She wrote in a letter to Koussevitzky, and I quote, "Unfortunately, the work of a woman composer is preconceived by many to be light, froth, lacking in depth, logic, and virility. Add to that the incident of race, I have colored blood in my veins, and you will understand some of the difficulties that confront one in such a position," end quote. It was her second letter to Koussevitzky, and there is no evidence that he ever replied to her. After her death, unfortunately, she faded into the background of a canon dominated by white male composers, and much of her work was thought to have been lost until the trove of manuscripts was discovered in 2009 by those house renovators. Florence Price completed her second violin concerto in 1952, just about 1 year before her sudden death at the age of 66. And she was just beginning to explore very promising career possibilities in Europe. The manuscript was never published and was considered lost sometime after 1975 when Price's daughter died. And then it remained in the attic of this home until again it was discovered by the renovators. The discovered manuscripts, thank goodness, were turned over to the University of Arkansas, and the fortunate circumstance of our violinist, Arend Kahng, serving as professor at the school, and her connection with the Arkansas Philharmonic led to the premiere of the concerto in February of 2018. This is an extraordinary work, compact, concise, concentrated, and very powerful. In fact, many scholars, now that the concerto is known, are comparing it in the same class as Samuel Barber's great concerto, as well as many of the other important concertos from the middle of the 20th century. The piece is written in the form of a rondo, which means a repeating section comes again and again, which is particularly helpful in this work that is through composed. That is, it's composed from the beginning to the end without a stop. There are no breaks between the sections or the movements of the piece. So the recurrence of this main theme that you hear at the beginning of the concerto is a great glue or something that makes the work cyclical or cohesive and holds it together. It's not a long concerto. It's only about 13 and a half minutes, but within those 13 and a half minutes are packed a kaleidoscope of musical episodes and styles and moods and tender moments that require some blistering technique from the solo violinist, as well as some beautiful lyrical passages, as you'll hear. And the world premiere took place on February the 17th, 2018 in Bentonville, Arkansas, with the Arkansas Philharmonic Orchestra, Arend Kahng as soloist, and I had the great honor of leading that performance. Now, that's plenty of information about Florence Price and the concerto for the time being. Let's welcome back Dr. Kahng and ask a few questions about this fascinating work and also the circumstance of its resurrection, discovery, reconstruction. Arend, do you recall when this piece was brought to your attention?
I would say it was probably about 2015 or so. So actually quite recently, we, as in the University of Arkansas, hosted a Florence Price symposium in 2014, 2015. And around that time, there was sort of a kaleidoscopic retrospective, if you will, of all of her keyboard works, her historians and musicologists who were speaking about her legacy, chamber works, vocal works. And of course, I was therefore introduced to her string chamber music. And many of the students in orchestra played her tone poems, and I was taking part also in helping with the string quartet, the 1929 G major string quartet, which was my first introduction to Florence Price. I asked Jim Greason, my colleague who hosted the symposium, to give me a little bit more information about Florence Price. And of course, it's difficult to summarize a person's legacy in life in such a simple answer, but he basically said she was a family friend and a contemporary of also William Grant Still. And so my first instinct was, why is it that history chose to commemorate and memorialize William Grant Still, but not Florence Price? Grout is sort of the standard musical history textbooks that a lot of colleges use, and that was the textbook that kind of gave me the survey of Western European classical music, and it's grouped sequentially and chronologically. And so in the 20th century, William Grant Still and his Afro-American Symphony is a major chapter. And so I led to, well, part of my exploration and journey was I need to find out more about this person. And I need to find out also, just to speculate, why one person in a way was sort of forgotten to history and another person is sort of canonized. So long story, long answer to a very simple question. About 2015, I started the project to learn the concertos, and just the decision, I think, to record it around 2016, 2017. And 2017 was when the recording took place.
And it's such a fascinating consideration to know that William Grant Still and Florence Price, both residents of Little Rock, Arkansas, knew one another, and yet history handled them very differently. And that's an excellent point, and one I think many in the musical world are trying to aggressively and retroactively try and address, which I'm delighted about, and which the premiere of this concerto was one great effort forward in that effort. Well, when you first saw the concerto, it was in manuscript form. Any recollections about the condition of the materials, and especially of the solo violin part?
Yes, it was all in one box. There were several copies of it, which I thought was interesting. There's so many little disorganized thoughts and impressions that I recollect. I was noting earlier that my green screen actually is the first page of the second violin part to the second violin concerto. And as you can see, the writing is quite neat. And I found the score to be similarly neat and well organized. There were certain notes that she had written, things crossed out, obviously, as she was thinking through her compositions. But it also occurred to me that I, living in the 21st century, take a lot of things compositionally for granted, basically living in a digital world. It occurred to me that she, after she finished this 100-page handwritten score, would then have to handwrite all of the orchestral parts. So when I found the manuscripts, there were these scores, but also the beginnings of what I think were the orchestral parts that she would have needed to write by hand. And just the thought of this, not having the luxury of just extracting files, for example, it made me appreciate just the laborious and time-consuming process that it would have required. Some of the parts were not consistent. So there were several parts that she would have had to write for example, second violin. The page turns were happening at different measures, because sometimes she would have 5 measures in one line, sometimes she'd have 6. And so it was interesting to me also that it seemed that going for an exact photocopy, but by hand, was something that was not happening either. So just sort of the messy process that happens when one goes through this process by hand is something that I appreciated. Same token, I would say it was incredibly neat at the same time. So it was messy, but also neat. The thought process, the feeling of somehow being closer to one's music because there wasn't somehow a digital device in the way was something that I also started to wonder about, and wondered about what processes in our lives remain untouched by technology or digital devices. And very little, actually. Even when I practice, I may use my phone as a metronome, for example. And so I very much felt like I was traveling back in time. I very much felt the love and the labor that went into the process of composition. I also felt sort of the solitude and the intimacy of what it may have been like to go through this process privately. So much of what a composer goes through, of course, is unseen, and only after the fact does it become known. And of course, only when a performer perhaps performs it does it become somehow concretized. And so I was going through a variety of, as I say, sort of disorganized and competing thoughts. But it was also truly a memorable experience for me because as a classical performer, I'm accustomed to basically encountering music that has already been edited and published by other people. And so having this experience of primary research is very unusual for me. I know for a lot of historians this is kind of what they do all the time, but for me it was a real honor to be able to have that kind of intimacy with an artifact in a way.
It's really exciting. For those who are not familiar, the back screen to Urgine is that manuscript is absolutely extraordinary. I think any performing musician who has performed for manuscript of any kind can attest that that is perhaps the closest you can get to computer generated notation, because it's just beautiful. Lines are straight, things are uniform in size, the small notes are a cue that's written there. I mean, it's really remarkable. So still, the discovery of a work that has never been performed, never been recorded, gives one a sense of ownership. And in this particular case, in the Violin Concerto, it was resurrected and the parts were taken. And as Urgine mentioned before, there were questions in the score that were not apparent. The solution to some of the problems and discrepancies weren't apparent. And in the first iteration, in fact, the version that we performed at the premiere, some choices were made based on the information that we had. After our premiere, Richard Bobo, who is a bassoonist and also the librarian of the Arkansas Philharmonic Orchestra, had access to some additional materials and was able to solve some of the discrepancies and questions in the second version. And it is yet another version. Urgine and I performed this concerto together in Portland, Oregon in fall of 2019, and it was this second version. And there are some notable differences, but it's a living work in many ways, trying to determine what the composer intended with limited knowledge and materials. And it's been an exciting process. And Urgine, I'm curious, now that you performed the work, gosh, with I think 3 orchestras now, is that right?
Yes.
3 orchestras. Is this piece a signature piece in your repertoire, or something that's at least a standard part of the repertoire you're performing?
Absolutely. And I really resonated with what you just said, Stephen, about a living work, because in my initial attempt to make sure that the recording was exactly what I wanted, I think I experienced a lot of anxiety of whatever the opposite of a living work would be, which is I wanted this to be my final statement. And the idea that I would make a final statement early on in my experience with a work is just completely intimidating, if not just impossible. And so it's been interesting to go back and, for example, listen to my own recording and think of little things that I would do differently. It's also been interesting to just remind myself that even in a concerto situation where most people would think that the soloists call the shots, basically, that it at the end of the day is a collaboration, and that anytime you have all the different players that come together, one sort of discrepancy or difference in the variable completely changes a phrase or a sentence or the way that the whole work comes together. And so that's been form the same concerto in such close proximity together with different orchestras and get to explore the small but profound questions that often we don't have the opportunity to do when we're rushed and we have to perform at once. So definitely it has become a signature piece. But I'm also reminded, I don't know if I should be putting a but, maybe I should be putting an and. It's a signature piece, and I realize that it really does take a village for this work to be realized.
Well, quickly, before we play the video recording of that premiere, are there any aspects or points that our listeners should look out for while listening to this piece, especially if it's their first time?
I will share. I will share two things that I think might be interesting. Ultimately, of course, I really hope that I don't try to over-explain something because I think ultimately it should be a personal experience and also an experience untainted by somebody else's experience or reality. One thing that I have been told after a performance is how lush the piece is and how beautifully orchestrated and just it really kind of, in a way, despite it being in the 20th century, I think belongs to sort of the grand style of concerto playing from the 1900s, or the 19th century. And so I think that that kind of lushness is something notable. And just as a player, it's something so enjoyable to be able to bring out of the instrument, to express in the concerto. And so I hope listeners will enjoy partaking in that. The other thing that I wanted to share is the discontinuity, actually, of the sudden channel switching, I would say, that seems to be happening. You spoke earlier about the rondo sense of cyclic structures. And I find two things interesting about that. One, which is the repetition of an idea and how that repetition may take on a different meaning as you continue to repeat it. So for me, the second theme, the lush theme, every time it comes back, it's familiar, but it's different. And it also seems to have very little transition time. So oftentimes it still continues to surprise me when it comes, and also when it comes out of it and goes back to sort of the more jaunty melodic material. It's something that I wasn't quite sure how to bridge, but it's something that I think now, as I listen to it more and I live with the piece more, it's something that I think is so unique. The way in which she switches so quickly and acrobatically between the two materials. And so I hope that audiences will enjoy, in a way, the unapologetic discontinuity of these themes.
That's very well described. So without any further ado, let's listen to this wonderfully musical channel switching of Florence Price in her Violin Concerto No. 2 in the world premiere of this concerto from February the 19th, 2018, Arkansas Philharmonic Orchestra and Dr. Arend Kahng as soloist. Brava again to our wonderful soloist, our very own concertmaster, Dr. Kahng. Ergene, that was just amazing. And congratulations again.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the Arkansas Philharmonic Orchestra. Thank you to you, Stephen. Thank you to all the musicians. As I was saying before, it takes a village. So thank you so much.
Well, and what a great honor it was to be able to embrace a work and give it its world premiere, to bring it to life. And now, from that initial premiere, it has sprung into new form and is getting performances all over the country, all over the world. And a lot of that is due and thanks to you. Many thanks to the Arkansas Philharmonic for adopting this project. Thanks to Peter Hamby, our video and audio producer, and Jason Miller, executive director. Thank you for joining us tonight. We look forward to presenting more presentations like this online. And until we're together again making beautiful music, stay well and stay healthy. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good night.
Good night.